Welcome to News from Neptune for January 31st in the fifth week of 2020. I'm Carl Estabrook. The socialist Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a self-proclaimed socialist government in Germany in the aftermath of World War I, said, quote, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what's happening." That's worth recalling in a week when a leading liberal presidential candidate, Elizabeth Warren, called for criminal penalties for spreading false information online. I'm not making it up. That's what she said. CNBC, that fount of wisdom, reported Warren proposed to combat disinformation by holding big tech companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google responsible for spreading misinformation, close quote. Since 1990, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week, sometimes even misinformation, and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I, with the help of J.B. Nicholson, will try to say some true things on a "If God had meant us to vote, she would have sent us candidates" edition of News from Neptune. I want to talk about discussion of the Green Party, believe it or not, a little later today, but we'll begin with David Green.
Well, apropos to what you just referred to, it shouldn't go unnoted for humor value, if anything else, that George Soros, a very wealthy man, who some claim runs the world, got on the New York Times op-ed page this morning and advocated for the fact that Mark Zuckerberg, also a very wealthy man, shouldn't be running the world. Did you see that?
I didn't see that, but he's agreeing with Elizabeth Warren, huh?
Well, he's saying that Mark Zuckerberg, George Soros, okay? Mm-hmm. George Open Society Soros. George, I don't believe the conspiracy theories, but he runs the world about as much as anyone does. Mm-hmm. That George Soros is accusing, or is claiming that Mark Zuckerberg shouldn't have the power to decide what gets on Facebook and what doesn't get on Facebook. I'm not quite sure how to untangle that, and I didn't read what the argument is. And there's probably some good arguments in there, and there's probably some things that need to be done in relation to Facebook, although, Facebook could end up being just a passing fad because everybody's going to be on Twitter, and then after that it's going to be something else, and after that it's going to be something else. So it isn't just Facebook.
That's true.
And so I didn't know quite what to do with that. I'll read it later. Yeah. Do you have any comment on that?
Only that it seems to me interesting that we get this from George Soros. I mean, is this a matter of it takes one to know one? I mean, is that
it would seem to be the case. Yeah. I mean, it's just kind of. I mean, he must be aware that some people are gonna accuse him of calling the kettle black.
There is an aspect of this that has a background, so to speak, in that the sort of the battles for public attention amongst newspapers at the beginning of the 20th century is something like what we're seeing in this sort of controversy, and the influence on American politics at that time was very important. As you could say that in some ways, the Spanish-American War was the result of a search for circulation by a New York newspaper that felt the best way to get people to buy their newspaper was to pronounce sensational things about the American foreign policy. That sounds remarkably contemporary, it seems to me, and it's fairly interesting. And the twist of the Soros and Zuckerberg connection is that the First Amendment to the American Constitution was designed to protect the sorts of things that these media giants of a century ago or even now are publishing. But the way around it that we find these days, illustrated by the example you give, is that commercial interests, corporations, take over the publication of that free speech and censor it. And that's what's being called for by Elizabeth Warren and apparently by George Soros. And that's the point that Mr. Zuckerberg is busily saying that his company does very well. We keep bad stuff, misinformation, and so forth out of the public discussion by censoring the things that people post to Facebook. So the last case is worse than the first, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, there are real issues regarding Facebook and newspapers and journalism and libel and slander and all that stuff that need to be, and I haven't done very much reading on all this, sort of legalistic type reading on all this, but of course, I think there's probably a good case for libel laws. In fact, I'm going to kind of refer to that in my next comments. But let me just also say that in case anybody's watching this show who was born after 1900, that you're referring, of course, to William Randolph Hearst.
Yes.
In case anybody is too young to know who William Randolph Hearst is.
I was protecting his reputation.
Yeah. So, but let me get this bit of unpleasant business out of the way, if you don't mind, Carl.
Certainly.
And I do mean unpleasant business. It's quite unpleasant, and I'm not happy to have to talk about this. I wasn't happy to have to write this letter, to sit down and write this letter and send it to the News Gazette yesterday, but I felt, and I had decided not to, and then I changed my mind. And my letter goes something like this. This responds to Scott Reeder's column entitled, "There's Another Aspect to Kobe Bryant's Legacy," from January 29th, published this past Wednesday in the News Gazette. Reeder writes, quote, "At best, Bryant was an adulterer. At worst, he was a rapist," end quote. And then the rest of the letter is my own words. "It's important to note that it cannot be publicly known at any level of empirical credibility whatsoever that Bryant was a rapist. That means that when one accuses Bryant of being a rapist, one does so with 0% certainty regarding the truth of that statement. Not 90%, 50%, 10%, 5%, or 1%, 0%. In other words, such a claim has the status of a public fiction. This does not mean that Bryant did not rape his accuser. It means that one cannot claim to know that. The reason this accusation remains unverifiable and therefore unknowable is that the alleged victim chose not to proceed with the criminal case. That choice may have been coerced by tactics of both the defense attorneys and the media, as Reeder suggests. But again, Reeder cannot know that at any level. He cannot know that at any level of certainty whatsoever, and neither can anyone else. It is obviously for good reason that our legal system requires public testimony, material evidence, and cross-examination. It is therefore obvious that, quote-unquote, believe all women cannot be a credible basis for determining legal outcomes of sexual assault charges, and that no lawyer or judge would support such an assertion. it shows poor judgment for reader to project his own personal trauma on this case. And let me define that by saying that reader was a rape victim as a child, and that kind of course supercharged his sensitivity, or supercharges his sensitivity to the issue of rape. But I felt the need to write that because I feel like first of all, I feel like it needs to be said and that probably nobody else is going to say it. Second of all, it is important to respect what we know, what we can know, and what we don't know, even regardless of the fact that in issues of sexual assault, or in cases of alleged sexual assault, there are always going to be murky areas. There are always going to be he said, she said. It's obviously a tough issue. It's obviously a highly charged issue. But even given all that, in this political context of sort of liberal feminist identitarian politics, I think that we also need to be very careful to draw some lines about what can be said to be true and what cannot said to be true, especially in newspapers, which are, as far as I understand, subject to libel laws. So if Scott Reeder, Kobe Bryant's dead, and I'm sad about that, of course, and if Scott Reeder, if it's not libelous to accuse a dead man of being rapist, to out and out accuse him of being one, or to almost appear at least to be doing that, then I think that should be noticed, along with all the other issues surrounding the legacy of Kobe Bryant.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune. We're trying to talk about things that are reported and indeed not reported in the public press in the largest sense. I want to turn to an open letter to the Green Party about 2020 election strategy. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should point out that both David and I have had some various truck with the Green Party at various times and have various opinions on the party then and now. But this is a letter produced by a number of significant political commentators about what the Green Party should be doing in regard to the 2020 presidential election. I quote, "As the 2020 presidential election approaches, the Green Party faces the challenge of settling on a platform, choosing a candidate for president, and deciding its campaign strategy. In that context, Howie Hawkins, a contender for Green Party presidential candidate, recently published a clear and cogent essay titled, 'The Green Party is Not the Democrats' Problem.' It represents a precedent Green Party stance which may guide Green campaign policy. We agree with much, but find some ideas very troubling. The stance offered in Hawkins' article says, quote, the assertion that the Green Party spoiled the 2000 and 2016 elections is a shallow explanation for the Democrats' losses. That in 2000, the Supreme Court stopped the Florida recount, that many factors elected Trump in 2016, including black voter suppression, Comey publicly reopening the Clinton email case a week before the election, $6 billion of free publicity for Trump from the commercial media, and a Clinton campaign that failed to get enough of its Democratic base out. That the Electoral College gave the presidency to the loser of the popular vote, that most Greens are furious at a Democratic Party that joins with Republicans to support domestic austerity and a bloated military budget and endless wars, that the Green Party's Green New Deal science-based timeline would put the country on a World War II scale emergency footing to transform the economy to zero greenhouse gas emissions and 100% clean energy by 2030, and that the Green Party wants to eliminate poverty and radically reduce inequality, including a job guarantee, a guaranteed income above poverty, affordable housing, improved Medicare for all, lifelong public education from pre-K through college, and a secure retirement. And finally, that the Green Party strategy is to build the party from the bottom up by electing thousands of municipal and county offices, state legislators, and soon the House as we go into the 2020s. Close quote. We agree, to the authors of this letter, that many factors led to Democratic Party losses, and the Supreme Court was a big one, as was the Electoral College, and we too are furious at Democrats joining Republicans in so many violations of justice and peace. Likewise, we admire the Greens' Green New Deal and economic justice commitments, and also support a grassroots local office approach to winning electoral gains. So with all that agreement, why are we sending a critical open letter? The stance the article presents, which may guide the Green campaign for president, says, quote, to hold all other factors contributing to recent presidential victories constant and focus on the Green Party as the deciding factor is a hypothetical that is a logical fallacy because it assumes away a factual reality. The Green Party is here to stay. Close quote. However, our finding Green policy a factor in Republican victories in no way suggests that the Green Party should disappear, and our focus on factors within our reach to easily correct, for example, the Green Party role in contested states, is in fact sensible. The stance also says the Green Party is not why the Democrats lost to Bush and Trump, but even if true, that wouldn't demonstrate it won't be why this time. In any case, let's take Trump and Clinton and see how Green Party policy mattered. If Clinton got Jill Stein's Green votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, Clinton would have won the election. Thus, the Green Party's decision to run in those states, saying even that there was little or no difference between Trump and Clinton, seems to us to be a factor worthy of being removed from contested state dynamics, just like the Electoral College is a factor worthy to be removed across all states. We realize many and perhaps most Greens will respond that if those who voted for Stein in contested states in 2016 hadn't done so, they would have abstained. We don't know how anyone could know that, but for the sake of argument, we will suppose it is correct. Still, if these voters who preferred Stein did indeed erroneously believe that there was no difference between Trump and Clinton, surely to some degree that was a result of Stein refusing to acknowledge the special danger of Trump and insisting that while it would be bad if Trump won, it would also be bad if Clinton won, and refusing to state any preference. Similarly, those Stein voters did indeed erroneously believe that no harm could come from casting a vote for Stein in a close state in a close election, that also to some degree was surely a result of Green campaigning, insisting that Green voters bore no responsibility for the 2000 election result. And finally, if these voters did indeed erroneously believe that it was immoral to contaminate themselves by voting for Clinton or for a Democrat, surely in part that too was encouraged by Green campaigning that treated voting as a feel-good activity. Quote, vote your hopes and not your fears, close quote, as if fear of climate disaster, for example, shouldn't be a motivator for political action. The stance says the Green Party is not going back to the safe state strategy that a faction of it attempted in 2004. This means they will not forego running in contested states where Green votes could swing the outcome, as happened in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan in 2016, and they will not run in only 40 safe states where the outcome will be a foregone conclusion. But why reject a safe states strategy? Like Stein in 2016, some might claim that doing so can't help Trump win again or in any case that Trump's re-election would not matter all that much. Quote, he isn't that much worse, close quote. We write in hopes that no one in 2020 will rationalize campaign actions by making such irresponsible and patently false claims. And indeed, in his recent essay, Hawkins instead claimed a safe state strategy, quote, couldn't even be carried out. It alienated Greens in swing states who are working so hard to overcome onerous petitioning requirements to get the party on the ballot. Keeping the party on the ballot for the next election cycle for their local candidates depended upon the Green presidential vote in many states. It became clear that safe states was dispiriting and demoralizing because the party didn't take itself seriously enough to justify its existence independent of the Democrats. Few people, even in the safe states, wanted to waste their vote for a Green ticket that was more concerned with electing the Democratic ticket than advancing its own demands, close quote. This claims is the price the Green Party has to pay for a safe states strategy. Okay, let's take that as gospel. Where is an argument that this price is so great that avoiding it outweighs the price everyone, including Greens, will pay for re-electing Trump? Wouldn't Trump out of office, much less Sanders or Warren in office, not only benefit all humanity and a good part of the biosphere to boot, but also the Green Party? We have no way to assess the claim that Greens would find it dispiriting to remove themselves as a factor that might abet global catastrophe via a Trump re-election. But wouldn't Trump out of office, much less Sanders or Warren in office, not only benefit all humanity and a good part of the biosphere to boot, but also the Green Party? For that matter, weren't more potential Green Party members and voters driven off by the party's dismissal of the dangers of Trump than were inspired by it? Which grew more in the last 4 years, DSA or the Greens? And weren't the Greens in the late 80s and early 90s winning elections to city councils and other local offices across the country, consistent with a grassroots strategy, though for much of the past 20 years they've largely abandoned local and state contests, devoting nearly all of their attention to increasingly harmful races for president? Hawkins' own exemplary races for Senate and governor in New York State, and especially the Greens' successful mayoral races in politically important places like Richmond, California, as well as less visible places like New Paltz, New York, were exceptions. But how many Greens have used their hard-won ballot access to run for Congress or state legislature? Might the massive focus on presidential elections mark a decline in prospects for the localist strategy, not in advance of it? We're told, quote, Greens want to get Trump out as much as anybody, close quote. But how can that be if Greens would vote for a Green candidate and not for Sanders, Warren, or any Democrat in a contested state, knowing that doing so would mean Trump's victory? If during the 2020 election campaign, the Green candidate campaigns in contested states, knowing that he or she might be winning votes that would otherwise have gone to Sanders or to Warren or whoever, causing Trump to win the state and win the Electoral College, how could that possibly evidence wanting Trump to lose as much as anyone? Indeed, if a Green candidate weren't telling everyone who was a potential Green voter to vote for Trump's opponent in contested states, how could that evidence that Greens want Trump to lose as much as anyone? Let us put our question another way. It's election night 2020. The vote tallies are in. Which way would the 2020 Green candidate feel better? Trump wins, and the Green candidate gets 250,000 votes across the contested state, more than enough for Sanders or Warren or whoever to have won. Or Trump loses, and the Green candidate gets no votes in the contested states, but a bunch extra in other states as a result of having more time for campaigning there. Greens tell Democrats to stop worrying about the Green Party and focus on getting your own base out. We agree on the importance of Democrats getting their base out, starting with nominating Sanders or, at worst, Warren. That wouldn't be worse. But how does that warrant the Green Party risking contributing to Trump winning? The stance asks, so why are we running a presidential ticket in 2020 if our strategy is to build the party from the bottom up? The stance answers, Because Greens need ballot lines to run local candidates, securing ballot lines for the next election cycle is affected by the petition signatures and our votes for our presidential ticket in 40 of the states. Greens will pay a price for not running in contested states. Our advice to Greens would be to notice the infinitely bigger price that millions, even billions of people will pay for Trump winning. The stance says, quote, Greens don't spoil elections, we improve them. We advance solutions that otherwise won't get raised. We're running out of time on the climate crisis, inequality, and nuclear weapons. Greens will be damned if we wait for the Democrats. Real solutions can't wait. But real solutions will require Trump out of office. Real solutions will become far more probable with Sanders or Warren's, or whoever, in office. Real solutions will become somewhat more probable even with the likes of Biden in office. To conclude, is a Green candidate running for president after the summer really going to argue we shouldn't vote for Sanders in contested states, not just to end Trumpism, but also to enact all kinds of important changes, including urging and facilitating grassroots activism and thereby advancing Green programs? We offer this open letter in hopes of prodding discussion of the issues raised. And believe it or not, this long screed is signed by Noam Chomsky, Bill Fletcher, Barbara Ehrenreich, Kathy Kelly, Ron Daniels, Leslie Kagan, Norman Solomon, Cynthia Peters, and Michael Albert, our candidate for the eventual composer. That is, I take all this time to read this thing because I was so astonished by it, quite frankly. I was so astonished primarily that Noam Chomsky lent his name to it, and so did a number of the other signatories whom I would not have expected to do so. Am I delusional these days, David? What's going on?
Well, you may be, but maybe not about that
I see,
necessarily.
there is that. There is always that possibility.
Yeah, so you're not buying it.
I'm not buying. I think it's.
When I came in last week, after having read that letter, I basically said, well, it's reasonable enough, except what disconcerted me is that they lumped in Elizabeth Warren with Bernie Sanders, or even Joe Biden with Bernie Sanders.
As they finally made clear.
And at this point, that doesn't work for me in terms of feeling that a lesser evil. I mean, I assume that they don't see Sanders as a lesser evil, whereas they probably see Biden as defined in that way. And I'm just not sure how lesser the evil of putting neoliberal Democrats back into power is going to help move us forward.
I think that's right. I mean, if you want to argue that since policies are more important than candidates, Greens wishing to see certain policies prevail means that the presence of a Green candidate, if the presence of a Green candidate can be reliably predicted to contribute to the election of a candidate opposed to Green policies, that Green candidate should withdraw. That abstract account makes sense to me. But the notion that it applies here, that the election, for example, of Trump over Clinton is such a disaster that the Green Party should have got out of the way and made sure that the votes that went to Greens went to Clinton, that seems to me far less clear because we're talking about the actual candidacies of Clinton and Trump, and even if it is the case that the presence of the Green Party in the presidential election influenced the outcome, and that is certainly arguable, it's not clear to me that that means immediately the Green Party should have got out and helped Clinton win. It's not a clear victory, it seems to me, to have Clinton beat Trump. I have no brief for either Clinton or Trump, but the assumption, which the letter makes, that it would have been far better for Clinton to be elected. That was indeed, by the way, Chomsky's view. That seems to me to be at least arguable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm tired I'm tired of getting back to the same point about who's responsible for George W. Bush in 2000 or Donald Trump in 2016.
No.
And one can argue that suppose that Ralph Nader had somehow been able to take himself off the ballot in Florida and not allow write-ins, and that the people who ended up voting for him were left to whatever choice they made. Well, that probably wasn't going to work for very many of them, given that, to say, oh, well, you've put this out for me and now you're drawing back and because you want me to vote for, in that case, Al Gore. I'm not going to do it. The Green Party doesn't control who votes for them in Michigan, Ohio, or anywhere. It doesn't control what people do in the polling booth. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about, well, they would have voted differently if they hadn't been on the ballot. Maybe some of them would have, but most people who would bother to vote for Green, especially in those states, are probably not people that are going to vote for a Democratic Party represented by Hillary Clinton.
Aaron Maté, who writes well on the relationship of the parties to the Russiagate nonsense all along, writes, the fantasy world that Democrats live in is extremely dangerous for the real world that the rest of us live in. In the real world, Trump has ramped up tensions with Russia with his hawkish policies on nuclear weapons, NATO, sanctions, and aggression towards Russian allies. But people like Michael Tracy write, if acquitted in the Senate, what would stop the president from continuing to side with Putin? Such an embarrassing question was just posed by Elizabeth Warren, and Klobuchar, but what else is new? I mean, this is the notion that the problem here is Trump's association with Vladimir Putin is really quite remarkable, and so far from the facts that we have to understand. There are other reasons that we find this sort of madness prevalent in amongst Democrat liberals. This is astonishing, and I do think it gives us some indication of why the political establishment is so opposed to Trump to lead us through this whole impeachment nonsense and to continue the campaign to get Trump out of office, not just destroying his reelection policies. It comes down to some fairly fundamental things about the political establishment in the U.S., which has to keep up the fantasy that Russia and China must be kept in place by American wars and American war provocations. And the reason for that, in the eyes of the American political establishment, is that if we don't do that, the economic consequences to the American ruling class will be dire. We have to make sure that, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said years ago in his account of general American politics, that peer competitors to American economic hegemony do not arise in Eurasia. That's the baseline of American foreign policy and American economic policy, world economic policy, for literally generations. And the fear was that Trump was going to interfere with that. In office, Trump, who had indeed suggested he would interfere with that in the campaign, has not done so. And he's been a perfectly obedient chief executive. But the American political establishment can't take the chance that he might mean some of the things that got him elected. that he said in the last campaign, the attacks on neoliberalism and neoconservatism, and that those attacks might actually take place. It's the defense of those policies that's the heart of ruling class politics in America. And anyone who threatens it, whether from the right or the left, makes no difference, whether it's Sanders or Trump, must be destroyed.
So there's a fellow named Anthony DiMaggio who writes for Counterpunch, who's a political scientist and does a lot of polling. And I've been critical of him in the past because he's used his polling methods to try to convince everyone that Trump got elected mainly because of a bunch of white racists or white racism. But he did write one paragraph this morning in his column that I thought was worth noting for a couple of reasons. I don't actually agree with the whole thing, but let me just read it. Mm-hmm. As a professional politician, Sanders, referring to Bernie Sanders, of course, hasn't been central to progressive movement building, but he has declared support for these movements via his alliances with Fight for 15, the Madison protests, those referring to Wisconsin, etc., and Occupy Wall Street. Contrary to other Democratic primary candidates, he recognizes the importance and centrality of such movements to driving progressive political change. Furthermore, the public is increasingly attuned to the bankruptcy of Democratic establishment politics, regardless of what the party's pundits say. Their efforts to prop up Bill Clinton's New Democrat, quote-unquote, coalition represent a last desperate gasp of air for a party that has struggled for years to remain relevant in an era of mass content with government. Sanders' rising popularity in recent primary polling suggests that much of the party's base hungers for a serious left alternative to the Democrats' pro-business politics. I don't agree with this. I think it's kind of a jaundiced statement for him to say that Sanders hasn't been central to progressive movement building. He's probably been as central as anyone else,
For longer than anyone else.
Yeah, for longer than anyone else. That's a kind of a churlish comment for him to make, and I think it's coming from the same place that it comes from, this sort of, identity politics skepticism place.
Yes, that's well put.
Where Sanders just isn't, he hasn't been supportive of Black Lives Matter and certain aspects of liberal feminist politics, although he hasn't been, even that's silly to say, because he's done, as Adolph Reed is always pointing out, he's supporting programs that would disproportionately benefit black people and women, especially working class women. So I think that's just being churlish on Anthony DiMaggio's part, but still, it's worth noting that that Sanders, because Sanders is catching this wave, and that the polls, whereas the polls for a long time were just showing him all mixed up with Warren and Biden and all this, it's clear that at least in the Iowa polls or the national polls that have been coming out, that he's getting 30% or so of the Democratic primary vote. And how this plays out state by state, of course, this isn't, who knows, because every time after Iowa, things will change. After New Hampshire, things will change. After South Carolina, things will change. It's not a fair system. It's a system that's programmed to rule out someone like Sanders.
Yes.
It's especially the alleged importance of the South Carolina primary and the alleged importance of the black vote in the South Carolina primary is whether this was planned or not by the Democratic Party, by the corporate Democrats, is clear that it's supposed to, in a state in which the Democrats will not win, to have the voters in that state, especially the black voters in that state, determine that someone like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden will come to the fore. So let's see if that strategy works this time. It's obviously not working as well, because even in South Carolina, Sanders is going to become more of a known quantity than he was in 2016, and he's running against the early onset Biden, as opposed to the late onset Clinton. I don't know what I meant by that, but
I think I do.
But anyway, that's just, all this stuff is just all that people should do, and I'm not happy with leftists who are cynical about the Sanders campaign. I'm just not happy with whether it's Jeffrey St. Clair or anyone else. I'm just not happy with people not looking at the popularity of Sanders under younger voters. I don't care if they're Brooklyn hipsters. I don't like Brooklyn hipsters, but it's more than just Brooklyn hipsters, you know.
Being closely related to a Brooklyn hipster, I would.
Oh, really? Okay.
I must admittedly, he's an aging hipster, but I think he probably qualifies. The skateboard alone would work
the
for that.
skateboard, okay.
In any case,
Yeah.
I think one thing to be seen here is that the Sanders campaign really is different. That's the reason he is so desperately hated by the Democratic establishment. Interesting example of that this last week was the appointment of the various officials who will run the convention. And they went out of their way, Tony Perez particularly went out of his way to make sure that the officials running the Democratic convention this summer are all people who are not only opposed, but in some cases personally despise Sanders, and that's the game is fixed, so to speak, as we've known for a long time, with the superdelegates that the Democrats use and the suggestion of control that they admit does not necessarily even have to follow what happens in the primaries because they're a private club and they can do what they want, and they are setting up the mechanisms to do what they want in the convention, and what they want is to make sure that Sanders is not nominated. So there's a lot of internal fighting going on in here. It's not just a case of the Democrats choosing a candidate to oppose Trump. Trump is not the problem. Trump is not the issue. The issue is whether a conventional candidate supporting the neoliberal and neoconservative policies of all recent presidents, and that would include the presumed Democratic nominee, what did you call him? Early onset Biden.
I know it's not right. I know it's not nice. I'm not a nice person sometimes.
But that's true. That would include the importance of his being nominated in the eyes of the Democratic establishment, and they will do a great deal to make sure that he's nominated rather than Sanders. That's going to be really the interesting fight, so to speak, the important fight in American politics this summer. We've got a long way to go there, but the danger is Sanders, and Sanders proposes things that are not palatable to the Democratic Party establishment, and he has to be stopped.
Yeah, just for those of you who don't live in the podcast verse like I do, and especially, or even I think Jimmy Dore has been pounding on this point. Sanders, get a spine. Don't capitulate. Don't let them make you apologize for not promoting identity politics in the way you think you should. I think that post the whole Warren debacle at the last debate, I think that Sanders is starting to get that message. He's starting to understand, hopefully, that these people are playing hardball, and that he is looking weak when he capitulates to that sort of pressure. He looks weak to the people who support him most, and apropos to what you were just referring to about the superdelegates, et cetera, the Democratic Party establishment, Jimmy Dore also did a nice program this week, and he was relying on the research of Kevin Gosztola. Jimmy hadn't heard of Kevin's, and so he wasn't pronouncing his name right. Kevin Gosztola is the young man up in Chicago. I say young because he's under 40, who runs the Shatterproof website and does the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast with the very excellent podcast with Rania Khalek. And Kevin did us the service. It's just a matter of Googling, really, of finding out who these people are, what their background is, and Jimmy Dore just sort of rattled it off there, so you could watch it in 15 or 20 minutes. So that's what we're dealing with here. The people like Chomsky and et cetera shouldn't give the game away to the the corporate Democrats by doing this.
Exactly.
They shouldn't. They should say, we're withholding our support from you, whether it's through the Green Party or any other means. We're withholding our support for you until we see that this is a fair process, ha ha, and that Sanders has a fair chance, ha ha, to get the delegates he needs to be nominated. All bets are off.
The level of craziness in this matter really peaked again or hit a new high this week when Elizabeth Warren says she wants, and I'm quoting here, a young trans person to interview and approve her education secretary choice.
Yikes.
Now look, yeah, that's right.
I hadn't heard that.
Oh yeah, she
Yeah.
wants a young trans person, she means a teenager, to interview the people that she would consider as president when she becomes president, for education secretary, and if they don't approve of them, they will not be appointed education secretary. Now, this is, the word pandering leaps to mind, but I think it's pressure being put on poor Warren. She's gone nuts. That's the best political explanation I can think of for this. I do have one thing I want to say about or one more thing I want to say about the letter that I was just quoting, the one that Chomsky put his name to, telling the Green Party to get out of the way of the Democratic nominees because it was so important that Trump be beaten by the Democratic nominee, even if it's Elizabeth Warren. Our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, writes, I disagreed with the sentiment expressed in that letter. Social progress doesn't come from getting out of the way and letting others determine the agenda. Social progress requires declaring what progress means and getting in the way of those who oppose one's idea of progress. Here's a bit more of a first draft of that idea of telling a candidate or party to step aside. And he notes that if he'd had more time, he would have written a shorter letter, and as is often said. Small d democracy is not served by telling people to resign their candidacy. That's a tactic which is, in the context of the upcoming national election, designed to placate a relatively minor difference between two awful corporate parties. I disagree with what Hillary Clinton stood for in both of her presidential campaigns. At what point would it have been socially accepted to say that the Democrats should set out that election to let more serious candidates, even relative unknowns with no political record, who have more amenable agendas, continue without her competition getting in the way? Or perhaps I'm not seeing how in this scheme some political parties are supposed to be given permission to stand for whatever they like without ever having to deal with the inconvenience of competition. Ahistorical nonsense. Despite what the Democrats tell you, the Green Party is not why Trump won in 2016, and Nader did not spoil elections. Focusing on 2016, the largest block of registered U.S. voters are those that chose not to vote for president. In a way, this gets to my previous point. Are we finally willing to admit that some voters would rather not vote at all than vote for a major party default, such as a would-be Green Party voter voting Democrat instead? I'm assuming that virtually all of that largest block of registered voters had no idea of any party or candidates outside of Trump and Clinton, due chiefly to successful restrictions on debating from the CPD, corporate media non-coverage, and expensive media buys, as they're called. That block were voters that Clinton failed to convince to vote for her, and apparently Trump didn't need to vote for him. Therefore, that was her responsibility to do, as it is with every candidate running for elective office, and her fault for not convincing those registered voters to vote for her. Harry Hawkins, the Green Party champion, Russiagate support puts me off his candidacy entirely. Harry Hawkins bought the whole Russiagate line.
Howard Hawkins.
Sorry.
Howie.
Howie Hawkins. Let's say it.
He calls himself Howie.
His
That's
given
how
name
I
is
know.
Howard, and he
Howard,
is called
yeah.
Howie Hawkins, yes. Jeff writes that Hawkins' Russiagate support puts me off his candidacy entirely, but I would not tell him not to run so that some other candidate has a clearer chance of winning. We should help people understand how little difference there is between the two corporate parties and help people see that they are better served by analyzing how the two major parties work together on the biggest issues of the day, which affect the most lives and involve the largest amounts of money. Chomsky's past advice included vote to keep the worst guy out, but that doesn't address that there's no clear worst major party when those parties work together on climate catastrophe, nuclear proliferation, maintaining and increasing war, which is also a major climate problem in itself, since the military is a huge polluter, and all the while these parties offer virtually nothing to be taken seriously on domestic policies, including a national jobs program, Medicare for all, and ending homelessness. I think the majority of the registered voters are tacitly, if unknowingly, rejecting Chomsky's advice when they didn't vote for president in 2016. How well has kept the worst guys out or encouraging better candidates to stay out of the race worked for us so far? In other words, are we sufficiently satisfied with what's going on that we can honestly say that we made a good choice? It seems to me that increasing impoverishment and leaving known beneficial policies on the shelf, 3 Medicare for all bills so far, none of which have any real chance of becoming law, for example, are clear signs that bolder steps are needed towards ending immiseration, which we're unlikely to see by keeping the worst guys out or encouraging people with better agendas to make way for the duopoly. I stand with Deb's advice of being better off for voting for what you want and not getting it than voting for what you don't want and getting it. Perhaps Debs explains why so many did not vote for president in 2016. Of the two candidates most registered voters knew something about, they were apparently unwilling to vote for what they did not want. I think this is right, and I think it seems to me that the advice that I read at length from Chomsky and friends this morning is it's ruined my week, I must say.
Well, let me ruin it a little bit more.
Okay.
We continue on with the saga of the 1619 Project,
Okay.
which continues to fascinate me, appall me, and actually I've gotten kind of a writer's block because I want to write something about this, but I don't know where to start. I've been doing so much reading and so much research on all the background of what the issues are involved in this, but I continue to look at both the background literature as well as the articles on the WSWS website. There's a couple more of them up this morning. Let me just read one paragraph, the first paragraph, because I think it's relevant to what we're talking about. A reply to the American Historical Reviews. This is the AHR, the main organ of the professional historians in this country, the professional scholarly academic historians in this country. A reply to the AHR's defense of the 1619 Project. Defense. Okay, so they've sided, at least in the name of this fellow named Alex Lichtenstein, in the name of defending what the 1619 Project is doing in the midst of the criticism of both socialists and some basically liberal establishment historians like James McPherson and Gordon Wood. But what David North and Tom Mackaman write this morning is the 1619 Project is, first of all, intended to bolster the Democratic Party's efforts to utilize racial identity and the concept that blacks and whites have historically opposed interests as a central electoral strategy. Ironically, this is a reworking of the political method that was employed by white supremacists in the South to maintain the dominance of the Democratic Party well into the 1960s, and which was later taken over by the Republicans in Richard Nixon's Southern Strategy. You may have also noticed that this week, and even in Jeffrey St. Clair's column this morning, that Bernie Sanders is accused of saying nice things, quote unquote, nice things about George Wallace. That's a whole separate issue back in the 1970s, but I think he's dealing with how he perceived Wallace as a kind of populist back then, which we could talk about, but still, who cares? That's 50 years ago. I don't care. What I do care is that Nicole Hannah-Jones, the person, the African-American person with one white parent, who is not that it matters, who is running the 1619 Project, is making a fool out of herself, and really what she's trying to do is basically intimidate people into thinking that you're racist if you don't support the 1619 Project. And to the credit of the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist website, they're not having it, and they're the only ones not having it, other than a few mainstream historians who are, for I think decent scholarly and professional reasons, kind of appalled at the way history is being treated in this context. And again, I have to throw in the name of Louis Project, who's on a complete tear in the support of the 1619 Project. He's posting things on the Marx mail list to get people to believe that the 1619 Project is just the cat's whiskers, and so I have to sit down and write something, or I'm gonna need some therapeutic help if I don't get some of this stuff off of my chest in written form.
Your doctor would encourage you to do it.
Yeah.
It's very important.
Yes, she would.
Okay.
So I don't know if you have any more we've got a minute or two left. We've got 3 minutes left, so I don't know if you had any comment about that, Carl, or when you followed it.
Actually, I want to end with a joke.
Okay, well, that's good.
It seems to me that we've been talking about jokes all day, but sometimes that's not recognized. Yeah. This refers to correspondence from people who've sent in notes to the program. Dale Stroh sent in a note from the Independent UK, a bemused account of Biden getting physical with a voter in the tense Iowa exchange over pipelines. The former president tells the climate activist to, quote, vote for somebody else, after essentially punching him. Our friend Bill Gorell sends comments on that by saying, Biden is weird as hell. I wonder what meds he's taking. I asked Bill what his guess was, and some guesses wasn't Bill's, some guesses was Adderall. That's a combination medication containing 4 salts of amphetamine, that's probably what Biden is taking. A friend of mine, my nephew as a matter of fact, the screenwriter Aaron Stockard, he wrote the movies The Town and Gone Baby Gone. Aaron wrote to say, for what it's worth, I lost many a train of thought and often found myself in the middle of long and disconnected tangential riffs mid-conversation when I took that drug. And I said to Aaron, it sounded like a chemical Facebook.
I'm that way without taking that drug. But
exactly, that's what I was saying.
Yeah.
And Aaron responded, yes, a day of Adderall and Facebook can leave you with as many regrets the following morning as a night of cocaine and karaoke. I thought that was an interesting
that was nice.
comparison,
I like that.
Yes. And Aaron added that for Trump, it's probably Sudafed and Twitter that leads to morning shame. That may be true. This is perhaps the best explanation of the events we've been talking about today we've offered so far.
I can my only explanation would in my own personal situation is caffeine and lack of sleep. So that's the best I can do with now that we've offended both the Alzheimer's community and the pharmaceutical industry. I think that's...
You've been watching News from Neptune.
Our work is done here.
For January 31st in the 5th week of 2020. And if God had meant us to vote, she would have sent us candidates edition. News from Neptune is presented by Carl Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Kevin Lau. See the research notes on the Facebook page for News from Neptune from J.B. Nicholson. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and A good night to you.